I once asked my grandmother what life was like before the world broke open. She looked out the window for a long time before answering. It was quiet, she said. We thought oceans were enough. In the early 1900s, America felt distant from Europe's tangled history. We had our own concerns: railroads stretching across prairies, factories rising in northern cities, silent films flickering in crowded theaters. The country was growing loud and confident, but still young. Most Americans saw the war clouds gathering across the Atlantic and figured they'd stay there. That was Europe's storm, kings' empires' old grudges. We were a nation of shopkeepers, immigrants, farmers. We had no czars or kaisers. We had baseball. President Wilson spoke of neutrality. We must be impartial in thought, as well as in action, he said. And for a while we were. Ships still sailed. Wall Street still climbed. Life went on. But the world doesn't ask for permission when it changes. And by the time we noticed the tide rising, it was already at our feet. We thought distance would keep us safe. We were wrong. A world on fire. The spark that lit the world came from a pistol in Sarajevo. You've probably heard the story. June 28, 1914. A young Serbian nationalist named Gavrilo Princip fired 2 shots that killed Archduke Franz Ferdinand of Austria and his wife Sophie. It should have been a local tragedy, a quiet note in the back pages of a European newspaper. But instead, it was a match dropped into a powder keg. Within weeks, one by one, the great powers of Europe began to fall into place. Like dominoes, Austria-Hungary declared war on Serbia-Russia, mobilized in Serbia's defense. Germany declared war on Russia, then France. And then Germany invaded Belgium, dragging Britain in too. Suddenly, the continent was aflame. Alliances that had been ink on paper became steel and blood. Cavalry charged into machine guns. Boys in blue coats and red pants walked into artillery. It was chaos, old strategies, new weapons, and no idea what they'd started. But back in the United States, we were watching from across the ocean, heads tilted. To most Americans, the war was confusing at best, senseless at worst. Who was right? Who fired first? Was it about an assassination, or pride, or land? Or was it all of them? And more importantly, should we care? The answer depended on who you asked. Some Americans, especially those with roots in Germany or Ireland, felt no loyalty to Britain or France. Others, especially those who had fled from autocracy, hoped the democratic nations would win. But for many, the war felt like someone else's problem. It was Wilson who said we should remain neutral in thought, as well as deed. But it wasn't easy. The news from Europe was hard to ignore. Newspapers told of trenches stretching for miles of barbed wire and poison gas, of cities turned to rubble. Maps changed weekly. Names like Verdun and the Marne began to trickle into conversation. But they still felt distant, like stories from another planet. Still, the ripples reached us. By late 1914, American businesses were already selling supplies to the Allies: boots, bullets, bread. The British Navy had blockaded Germany, and so most of our trade flowed to one side. Banks followed. Loans piled up. We said we were neutral, but our pocketbooks leaned heavily in one direction. And Germany noticed. There were protests at home, too. Some said the war was a racket money for bankers' death, for someone else's sons. Others warned that if we didn't help the Allies now, we'd face a stronger, unchecked Germany later. Wilson walked a careful line. He won re-election in 1916 on the slogan, "He kept us out of war," and most Americans believed him. Believed that peace was possible, that we could stand at the edge without falling in. But by then, the war wasn't just raging, it was evolving. Gas masks became standard. Tanks rolled across no man's land. The air filled with the hum of biplanes and the thunder of artillery. Every week, new weapons, new ways to kill, new nightmares. And through it all, Europe bled. Britain lost a generation on the Somme. France buried its sons in Ypres and Champagne. Russia's army crumbled. Even the Ottomans and Austro-Hungarians began to fracture under the weight. To us, it still seemed far away. But it wasn't. Not really. Ships crossed the Atlantic every day. Letters came back with tales of cousins and friends who had enlisted abroad. And while our feet were still dry, the water was rising. The world was on fire. And even from a continent away, we could feel the heat. Neutral, but not distant. We told ourselves we were staying out of it, that we were neutral, watching from the shore, while Europe tore itself apart. But neutrality, it turns out, is a complicated thing, especially when there's money to be made, especially when the oceans aren't as wide as they used to feel. By late 1914, the United States had become the arsenal of the Allies, even if we didn't say it out loud. We sold wheat to Britain, steel to France, ammunition, rifles, blankets, boots. Factories in Chicago and Pittsburgh hummed day and night, filling crates bound for the Atlantic. Dock workers in New York packed ships that flew no flags, but carried clear loyalties. And where trade went, banks followed. J.P. Morgan and other American financiers loaned billions to Britain and France. Quietly, efficiently. The kind of loans that only made sense if those nations won. If they lost, well, that money wasn't coming back. So yes, we were neutral. But it was a one-eyed sort of neutrality, seeing one side clearer than the other. And Germany noticed. Loudly. The German government saw the blockade Britain had placed on their ports, saw that American goods weren't reaching them, saw that American ships were fueling the other side, and they warned, if we couldn't get our supplies peacefully, we'd have to stop yours by force. That meant submarines. The German U-boats were new terrifying machines, long steel sharks lurking beneath the waves. They couldn't match the British Navy ship for ship, so they went underwater, struck without warning, slipped away into the dark, and soon American cargo ships started disappearing. The public back home didn't like it, neither did Wilson. But it wasn't enough yet to bring us in. The president still believed in diplomacy, still hoped the war could end without dragging America into it. In the meantime, the war economy at home was booming. Jobs were plenty. Wages were rising. Immigrants poured into northern cities to work in factories. Women filled roles traditionally held by men. Even farmers prospered. Wheat and corn were gold on the export market. But not everyone shared in the growth, and not everyone felt at ease. German Americans, once a proud, visible community, started to feel the pressure. Suspicion crept in. People whispered. Towns renamed streets. Sauerkraut became Liberty Cabbage. Schools dropped German language classes. The fear of spies and sabotage began to bloom. Wilson, still cautious, gave speeches about peace, about America's unique place in the world. He talked about being a beacon of reason, a force of balance. But in truth, we were already leaning. The money, the ships, the politics, the press. British newspapers widely read in the States painted vivid pictures of German atrocities, some true, some not. Images of ruined villages, wounded children, stories of bayoneted nuns, and burned libraries. Whether they were real hardly mattered. They shaped opinion. And then there was the romance of it all. The poetry, the uniforms, the idea that this was not just a war, but a crusade for civilization, for democracy, for the future. Young Americans unable to wait for their country to join, enlisted with the French Foreign Legion, with the Canadians, with the British. Pilots joined the Lafayette Escadrille and soared into history before their own country would call them heroes. We weren't in the war, but we weren't out of it either. It was like watching a house burn next door and passing your neighbor a hose, all while insisting you're not involved. But fire doesn't respect fences, and before long, the flames were coming our way. The sinking that changed everything on a clear afternoon in May 1915. The RMS Lusitania sailed off the coast of Ireland, steady, fast, proud. She was a beauty of a ship, sleek, modern, a floating palace that once held the blue riband for speed, the kind of vessel that made people believe in progress, in luxury, in crossing oceans with grace. She was also full of Americans, almost 2,000 people on board, men, women, children, some returning from business trips, some from honeymoons, some escaping the shadow of war for the safety of home. But the sea wasn't safe anymore. Not really. Germany had declared the waters around Britain a war zone. They warned that any ship, civilian or not, could be targeted by U-boats. The Lusitania's name was printed in German newspapers as a potential target. The warning was clear, but people boarded anyway, because it was unthinkable. Who would sink a passenger liner? A civilian ship? A ship with Americans? It happened fast. Just after lunch on May 7th, a German submarine spotted her silhouette. The U-boat captain fired a single torpedo. There was a dull explosion, then another larger, deeper. Some said it came from inside the ship. Munitions, coal dust. No one knew for sure. The Lusitania began to list. In 18 minutes, she was gone. Bodies washed ashore for days. 198. People died, among them 128 Americans. And suddenly the war wasn't far away anymore. It was right there in the headlines, in the drawing rooms, in the hearts of American families who had lost someone. The public reaction was swift. Outrage, shock, sorrow. Newspapers blared headlines like war drums. Editorials cried for justice. Politicians demanded answers. But Wilson, he held back. He condemned the attack, sent stern letters to Germany. But he did not declare war. He said America was too proud to fight, that we would remain the only great nation at peace. And for a time, that held. Barely. Germany, under pressure, eased back on submarine attacks. They promised not to target passenger ships, promised to warn vessels before sinking them. The world exhaled, but something had changed. The Lusitania shifted the American mood, from curious to cautious, from detached to disturbed. It made the war real. Mothers in Ohio wept over sons who drowned in Irish waters. Wall Street investors wondered how deep this would go. Preachers in Kansas spoke of judgment. College students argued about loyalty, justice, morality. And German Americans, they felt the shift most. Suspicion deepened. Flags vanished from porches. German-language newspapers folded. People changed their names. A quiet panic, the kind that grows in the space between mourning and anger. Behind it all, a question lingered. If this could happen once, what next? The war didn't pull us in that day, but it put a hand on our shoulder, and we started to turn. Preparedness and paranoia. After the Lusitania, no one could pretend the ocean was just water anymore. It had become a boundary between war and peace life, and death, and suddenly it felt thinner than anyone liked. America still wasn't in the war, but by 1916, it was clear we might not have that luxury forever, and that uncertainty. It started to stir something deep in the American psyche. Some folks began to talk about preparedness. Not war, not yet, but the idea that we should be ready just in case. President Wilson, who had run for re-election under the slogan, "He kept us out of war," also started to change his tone. Quietly, cautiously, he asked Congress to expand the Army. He supported the Naval Act of 1916, an ambitious plan to build the greatest navy in the world. He spoke of peace through strength, and people listened. Across the country, military drills popped up in fields and fairgrounds. College boys marched with wooden rifles. Factories began converting their lines from tractors to trucks, from kitchenware to shell casings. Even Boy Scouts got new merit badges for war preparedness. But not everyone was on board. Plenty of Americans still clung to isolationism. From Midwest farms to New York boardrooms, folks believed Europe's war had nothing to do with them. The idea of sending American boys to die in the mud of France was unthinkable. And organizations like the American Union Against Militarism warned that preparedness would only provoke war. And then there were the whispers: espionage, sabotage, spies in the shipyards, in the telegraph wires, in the wheat fields. Whether real or imagined suspicion spread like wildfire. In 1916, a series of mysterious explosions rocked the country. The most devastating came in July at Black Tom Island in New Jersey, a munitions depot supplying the Allies. In the dead of night, the sky lit up like a second sun. Shrapnel flew across the harbor. Windows shattered in Manhattan. People thought it was an earthquake or the start of war. It was later believed to be sabotage German agents trying to stop American support for Britain and France. And whether or not that was fully proven, the fear it planted was real. That fear began to shift the national mood. More and more Americans started to ask, are we really safe? And if not, shouldn't we do something about it? So the country began to arm itself, not with war cries, but with drills and policies, speeches and steel. You could see it in the posters: smiling soldiers in crisp uniforms, Liberty bonds, factory women with rolled-up sleeves, a new kind of patriotism, rising not loud, not reckless, but steady. Still, Wilson walked the tightrope. He spoke of peace with honor. He still hoped for diplomacy. In January 1917, he even gave a speech calling for a peace without victory, a settlement that wouldn't humiliate anyone, wouldn't plant the seeds for more wars. But that kind of peace needed cooperation. And from across the Atlantic, Germany had something else in mind. The fuse had been laid, the powder stacked, and the next spark would land much closer to home. The Zimmermann telegram. It started with a telegram. Not a bomb, not a torpedo, just a message sent through undersea cables, encoded in numbers tucked in wires, stretching across the Atlantic like veins. In January of 1917, British codebreakers intercepted a secret German communication sent from Berlin to the German ambassador in Mexico. It was routine to intercept messages during wartime. Most were harmless, dull logistics or formal reports. But this one made the room go quiet. It was from Arthur Zimmermann, Germany's foreign secretary, and its purpose was clear. If the United States joined the war against Germany, the German government wanted Mexico to join Germany in return as an ally against the United States. In exchange, Germany promised to help Mexico recover its lost territories, Texas, New Mexico, Arizona. Just imagine that. At a time when America was still officially at peace, still debating war in newspaper columns and dinner tables, Germany was plotting with our southern neighbor to carve up the country like a roast. It was bold, desperate even. The Germans knew their unrestricted submarine warfare resumed that same month might provoke America. But they believed the war would be won quickly before the U.S. could mobilize. And they thought, if America had to fight a war on its own soil, it might stay out of Europe. The British waited a few weeks before showing the telegram to the Americans. They had to cover their tracks. They didn't want Germany to know They'd cracked the code. But when they handed the decrypted message to President Wilson in late February, it was like handing him a match over a powder keg. The public found out soon after. March 1st, 1917. Newspapers across the country printed the text of the Zimmermann telegram. At first, people couldn't believe it. Some thought it was fake. British propaganda, maybe. But then Zimmermann did something unexpected. He admitted it, publicly, without apology. And the reaction in America was swift and furious. Even folks who'd been neutral or weary of war felt something shift. This wasn't Europe's war anymore. This was an insult, a threat, a betrayal. The idea that a foreign power would try to incite conflict on American soil, to stir up enemies at our border, and promise them U.S. land, it struck a deep chord, a patriotic chord, a defensive one. Wilson's tone changed too. He'd always been cautious, measured, but now he spoke with weight. In early April, he stood before Congress and said, "The world must be made safe for democracy." April 6, 1917, the United States formally declared war on Germany. And just like that, the line had been crossed. America, reluctant, proud, powerful, was in. The gears turned quickly. Drafts were prepared. Factories flipped. Trains rerouted. Speeches written. Propaganda churned. Boots were polished. Rifles issued. And families began to say goodbye. It's strange to think a single telegram could do all that. But it wasn't just the words. It was the timing, the feeling that we'd tried to stay out, that we'd warned, that we'd hoped for peace. And when that hope was met with torpedoes and secret deals, well, there was only one answer left, and the world was about to feel it. To war with reluctance. It didn't look like glory, not at first. When Congress declared war on Germany in April 1917, there weren't parades in every street or banners in every window. There was a kind of pause, like the nation had taken a deep breath and wasn't quite sure what it had just swallowed. Because America wasn't ready for war. Not logistically, not emotionally. The army at that time was small, barely 120,000 active-duty soldiers, with another 80,000 in the National Guard. That might sound like a lot, but Europe was fielding armies in the millions. Our weapons were outdated. Our uniforms didn't fit. Our officers had more experience with paperwork than trenches. But it wasn't just equipment. It was mindset. We weren't a nation raised on centuries of continental conflict. We didn't sing marching songs about lost provinces or ancient kings. Most Americans saw war as something over there, not who we were. Even after the declaration, some wondered if we'd actually go. But President Wilson knew we had to, and he knew we'd need more than volunteers. So, in May 1917, Congress passed the Selective Service Act, a national draft. It wasn't popular. In fact, Wilson had campaigned against a draft just years earlier. But now, it was the only way to raise a modern army in time. Within weeks, millions of men between 21 and 30 were registering. Some lined up proudly. Others went quiet. Some objected on moral or religious grounds. And yes, some simply ran. But for most, the draft was something you accepted, even if you didn't understand it. It came with the envelope in the mail, with your mother's tears, with your name read aloud at a town hall. And soon the boys were leaving. By train, by boat, by uniformed formation, through the town square. They carried duffel bags and letters, photos of sweethearts, small Bibles tucked into coat pockets. Most had never left their county, let alone crossed an ocean, and they had no idea what waited for them. But war wasn't just happening in Europe. It came home too fast. The government launched the Committee on Public Information, a vast propaganda machine. Posters went up everywhere. Uncle Sam wants you. Beat back the Hun. Food will win the war. Schools taught patriotism. Churches preached duty. German language books disappeared from libraries. Sauerkraut became Liberty cabbage. Even Beethoven was eyed with suspicion. Patriotism wasn't just encouraged, it was expected. People were asked to buy Liberty bonds to plant victory gardens, to conserve wheat and sugar and gasoline. Children collected scrap metal. Housewives rationed. And those who didn't comply, they were noticed. Neighbors watched neighbors. And fear, that quiet wartime companion, began to settle in. In the newspapers, you'd read about heroes, young men headed over there. In the shadows, you'd hear about men jailed for questioning the war, about women shouted down for speaking German in public, about immigrants suddenly choosing silence over song. But the war machine kept turning. By the end of 1917, American troops nicknamed Doughboys were shipping out. Slowly at first, inexperienced, nervous, carrying weapons they barely knew how to use, wearing gas masks they didn't yet trust. Most hadn't seen a trench. They still thought war was about bravery and straight lines. That would change soon. But in those first months, it all felt new, uncertain, strange. America had entered the war, but the war was only just beginning to enter America. Over there. The Atlantic was wide, but it wasn't empty. By 1917, it was hunted. German U-boats prowled the depths, waiting for troop transports and supply ships. Every crossing was a gamble. The first American soldiers, young, nervous, fresh in their uniforms, sailed into danger before they ever saw a battlefield. Convoys moved in tight formation, escorted by destroyers zigzagging through the waves. The boys slept in their boots. Drills came at all hours. Submarine sightings sent everyone racing to lifeboat stations. But most of them made it, and when they stepped onto French soil, something shifted. The world looked older, warier. Cobbled streets, stone villages, and a countryside already scarred by 3 years of war. Signs pointed toward the front, always the front. The locals waved, but there was sadness behind the smiles. They'd seen too many uniforms by then, too many boys arrive with wide eyes and leave in silence. The American troops were different, though. Taller, healthier, their boots new, their rifles clean, their spirits still intact. They sang songs on the march, joked with translators, carried chocolate in their pockets. But war doesn't care how fresh you are. The U.S. Army didn't rush to the trenches. At first, American soldiers were trained by British and French officers, given gas masks, taught how to dig, how to survive artillery barrages, how to live among rats' lice and the constant presence of death. Many weren't ready. They weren't ready for the mud-deep, clinging, swallowing boots whole. They weren't ready for the smell of decay, cordite, damp wool, and fear. They weren't ready for the silence between shellings, where the only sound was breath. And they weren't ready for the waiting. Most of war wasn't bullets and bayonets. It was hours in cold trenches, staring at gray skies. It was whispers at night, boots crunching, mud mess kits clanging in the dark. But they adapted. The doughboys learned fast. They practiced with grenades called pineapples. They memorized gas drill commands, gas masks, on in under 9 seconds. They wrote letters home full of false cheer, omitting the rats and the rain. Some even grew to love the camaraderie, the stolen cigarettes, the shared coffee tins, the jokes that made no sense to anyone who hadn't heard shells land too close. And still they waited for their turn. Because in those early months, American units were held back from major offensives. General John J. Pershing, commander of the American Expeditionary Forces, believed U.S. troops should fight as an independent force, not just folded into British or French units. He wanted Americans to learn, but also to lead. So while they trained and built camps and stockpiled supplies, the war continued without them. The French bled in the Chemin des Dames. The British pushed and stalled in Passchendaele. The Germans regrouped. Then came 1918. Germany launched a massive spring offensive, hoping to win the war before American numbers could tip the scale. The trenches shook, the lines buckled, and suddenly the Americans were called forward, not in theory, not in training, but in battle. And the doughboys, they went, into forests, into fields, into towns with names they'd never heard, but would never forget. Cantigny-below-Wood-Soissons. The war was no longer something they were watching. It was around them, inside them, and for too many, it would be the last thing they ever saw. But they fought, and the world started to notice. The war machine at home, while the boys shipped out the country they left behind, began to transform. America had entered wars before, briefly, cautiously, and usually far from home. But nothing like this. Not on this scale, not with this kind of urgency. The United States in 1917 was not yet a superpower, but it was a nation of factories, railroads, farms, banks, and newspapers. And once the declaration of war was signed, all of it, every bolt, every rail car, every headline, was drawn into motion. Washington didn't just ask for help. It took it. Congress created the War Industries Board, which began to direct the economy like a general commands troops. Factories once making bicycles or farm tools were converted to produce rifles, helmets, artillery shells. Railroads were brought under federal control. Raw materials were rationed. Prices were fixed. The automobile industry, still in its early bloom, began producing trucks for transport engines, for tanks, even parts for aircraft. Henry Ford rolled out machines for the Allies. Smoke poured from Detroit like it was trying to fog the Atlantic. On farms, wheat and corn became ammunition. Every bushel counted. The slogan was simple: food will win the war. The U.S. Food Administration, led by a man named Herbert Hoover, asked Americans to conserve. Meatless Mondays, wheatless Wednesdays. Leftovers became patriotic. Waste was frowned upon, and people astonishingly complied, voluntarily, proudly. Kids joined the effort too. They scoured alleys and backyards for scrap metal, collected peach pits to help make gas mask filters, planted victory gardens in empty lots and behind schools. It wasn't just adults fighting this war. It was everyone. And then there were the Liberty Bonds. Posters lined every wall, every train station, every post office, red, white, and blue ink, urging citizens to buy bonds to fund the war. A small investment for a big cause. There were parades. Famous actors sold them. Children were encouraged to collect pennies. Buying a bond wasn't just financial. It was moral. A symbol that you stood with your country. And if you didn't, well, that didn't go unnoticed. People kept an eye out. On their neighbors, on store clerks, on school teachers. German Americans, once a thriving and visible community, were under a magnifying glass. German churches were pressured to drop the language. German music disappeared from concerts. In some towns, even Beethoven was blacklisted, and German-sounding street names changed overnight. It wasn't fair. It wasn't right. But war doesn't always care about fairness. Meanwhile, women stepped forward, by the millions. With men overseas, women filled jobs in factories, shipyards, railroads, police stations. They rolled bandages, packed ammunition, ran streetcars. For many, it was the first taste of labor outside the home, and it planted seeds, quiet ones, that would grow louder after the war. In Washington, the draft kept expanding. By war's end, over 2.8 million men had been conscripted. They came from farms, cities, mountain hollers, and factory blocks. all folded into the same khaki, given numbers, sent east. The Committee on Public Information kept the narrative tight. Posters, pamphlets, films, songs like Over There and Keep the Home Fires Burning. War became part of the air, part of dinner conversation, part of schoolwork. And all the while, letters came back. From France, from the trenches, from boys who had once sold newspapers on corners or stacked crates in warehouses. Some letters were cheerful. Some were not. And behind every word, America kept building. One rivet, one bullet, one trainload at a time. Because war isn't just fought with rifles. It's fought with hammers and typewriters and silence when your son doesn't write back. The front line might have been in France, but the engine that powered it, that roared and smoked and never slept, was right here. Liberty and fear. They said we were fighting to make the world safe for democracy. But back home, not all freedoms were safe. As the war effort intensified, the U.S. government began to tighten its grip, not just on industry and transportation, but on ideas, on words, on loyalties, on silence. In June 1917, just 2 months after declaring war, Congress passed the Espionage Act. At first glance, it seemed logical. America needed to prevent spies, protect military secrets, keep shipping routes safe. But the law went further. It made it a crime to interfere with the draft, to obstruct military recruitment, to mail materials deemed disloyal. Even a speech or a pamphlet, if it discouraged enlistment or questioned the war, could lead to arrest. And people noticed. Socialists, pacifists, labor leaders, all became targets. One of the most famous was Eugene V. Debs, a former presidential candidate and lifelong labor activist. In 1918, he gave a speech in Canton, Ohio, calm, reasoned, but critical of the war and the draft. He was arrested, tried, and sentenced to 10 years in prison. His crime words. Across the country, newspapers were shut down, especially those in foreign languages, particularly German. A man named Robert Goldstein made a film about the American Revolution that portrayed the British negatively. It was pulled from theaters, and he was jailed under the Espionage Act because Britain was now an ally. Then came the Sedition Act of 1918, a sharper blade. It made it illegal to say, write, or print anything considered disloyal or abusive about the U.S. government, the Constitution, the military, or even the flag. And that was open to interpretation. A minister giving a sermon against violence arrested. A newspaper cartoon mocking military censors shut down. A woman refusing to sell Liberty bonds, questioned by federal agents. In towns across America, loyalty leagues sprang up. Volunteers who patrolled neighborhoods attended public meetings and reported anything they deemed suspicious. If you didn't fly the flag on your porch, someone might ask why. If you didn't speak English at the market, someone might follow you home. And if you spoke German, especially with pride, you learned to stop. Schools dropped the language. Churches stopped offering German services. Beethoven and Brahms vanished from symphony programs. In some towns, people burned German books in public squares. Fear doesn't need orders. It just needs permission. And the war gave it plenty. But there were quiet resistances, too. Letters passed between families in code. Songs sung behind closed doors. Speeches whispered in basements instead of shouted in halls. Most Americans supported the war. They planted gardens, bought bonds, rationed sugar, wrote to soldiers. But even those who believed in the cause began to wonder, at what cost? And when the war ended, when the last shell fell and the rifles went quiet, the silence that followed wasn't just relief. It was a moment to ask, what had we given up in the name of victory? And could we ever get it back? The Doughboys rise by early 1918. The American soldiers were no longer just the new kids. They still called them doughboys, a nickname no one can quite trace. Some said it came from the dust on their uniforms during training. Others thought it was a joke from British troops. Whatever the origin, the name stuck. At first, the Allies weren't sure what to make of them. The British saw them as brash. The French thought them too green. The Germans didn't take them seriously until they had to. Because as the German spring offensive roared across France that year, it became clear the Americans weren't just showing up anymore. They were stepping in, and fast. Germany had one goal in the spring of 1918: end the war before America could fully arrive. With Russian forces out of the picture, they moved hundreds of thousands of troops to the Western Front. For a while, it worked. British and French lines bent. Towns fell. Panic grew. Then came the Americans. The Battle of Cantigny. May 1918 was the first major American offensive of the war. Just a small town on a French map, but for the doughboys, it was everything. They trained for weeks, dug trenches, rehearsed assault plans. When they attacked, they moved fast, storming German positions, holding off counterattacks for days. It wasn't perfect. They lost men. They learned hard lessons, but they held the town. It was a message loud and clear. The Americans were here, and they were ready to fight. Then came Belleau Wood. It was hot, dense, miserable terrain. Germans had fortified the forest with machine guns and artillery. When American Marines were ordered to take it, they faced hell. But they didn't break. They charged through fields under open fire. They clawed through trees. They fought hand to hand among the roots. One Marine famously said, "Retreat hell, we just got here." By the time the forest was cleared, the doughboys had earned a new reputation, one the Germans wouldn't forget. In their reports, they began calling the Americans devil dogs. The French renamed the forest Bois de la Brigade de Marine, in honor of the men who fought there. From then on, the Americans were no longer a question mark. They were a force. The victories piled up. Château-Thierry, Soissons, Saint-Mihiel. Each one brought confidence. Each one brought cost. Letters home began to change. Less bravado, more silence between the lines. Still, they pushed forward, and Pershing kept his promise. He refused to let American forces be broken up and absorbed. He wanted an army that stood on its own, an army that earned its victories. So that's what they became. Not just fresh legs or borrowed help, but a new spear sharp enough to change the shape of the war. And as summer burned into fall, that spear would aim toward one of the final bloodiest chapters of the whole conflict, a place called the MEUSE-ARGONNE. But before that moment, the doughboys, farmers, factory workers, sons, brothers had risen, and the world had taken notice. MEUSE-ARGONNE, into the grind. There are forests in France where the trees still grow crooked, where roots twist around old helmets, where rain uncovers rusted rifles, where the soil remembers things it would rather forget. One of those places is called the Argonne. In the fall of 1918, it became the stage for the largest battle in American military history, a final push, a desperate gamble, a thunderstorm of men and metal known as the MEUSE-ARGONNE Offensive. It began on September 26th. The goal was simple: on paper, break through German defenses in the Argonne forest and cut the main supply rail that fed the German front. If that line snapped, so would the German army. But the Germans had held those ridges for years. They had dug in trenches, bunkers, barbed wire stacked like iron thickets, machine gun nests hidden in hills, artillery zeroed in on every trail, and into that wall the Americans marched. 1.2 million U.S. soldiers would take part before it was done. Farmers from Kansas, miners from Pennsylvania, immigrants from New York tenements, all under the same flag, all headed into the green maze. The forest swallowed them. The mud was endless. Trees turned to splinters. Gas lingered in the hollows. The air smelled of rain and cordite and rot. Progress was measured in yards, sometimes feet, sometimes not at all. Every hill had a number, every ravine a name. There was Hill 304, where blood turned the ground slick. Dead Man's Hill, where shells fell for hours. Châtel Chehery, where entire companies vanished in the smoke. Stories rose from the horror. There was Alvin York, a Tennessee sharpshooter and reluctant soldier. Deep in the Argonne, he took out multiple machine gun nests and captured 132 German soldiers, almost single-handedly. He didn't boast, said he was just doing his duty, but the legend grew. And then there was the Lost Battalion, more than 500 men, mostly from New York, who pushed too far forward and were cut off for days, surrounded out of food under constant fire. They refused to surrender. Carrier pigeons delivered their messages. Some were wounded, many died, but they held. Their commander, Major Charles Whittlesey, simply radioed, "We're along the road parallel to 276-4. Our own artillery is dropping a barrage directly on us. For heaven's sake, stop it." The shelling paused, and some of them lived. But most days in the Argonne weren't stories, they were grind. They were crawling through brush, hearing whispers in languages you didn't understand, praying your feet didn't snap a twig that would give you away. They were cold beans and trench foot, shrapnel and screaming, and still they pushed. Inch by inch the Americans advanced. The French fought alongside them. The Germans fell back slowly, stubbornly. And behind it, all the clock was ticking, because while the guns thundered in the Argonne, something else was happening. Back in Germany, the seams were tearing. The army was exhausted, the people starving, the empire cracking. Mutinies spread through the ranks. Protests filled the streets. The Kaiser's grip slipped by the day. And in the muddy woods of France, the Americans kept moving forward. The MEUSE-ARGONNE offensive would last 47 days. It would cost over $26,000 American lives and leave more than $120,000 wounded. It was a price almost no one expected to pay so late in the war. But it broke the line, cut the rail, bent the enemy until something inside snapped. And as November arrived, a word began to spread. Armistice. Not yet, but close. Close enough to hear it breathing. And after years of blood and smoke, the world held its breath. The 11th hour. It came not with a bang, but with a time 11 a.m., November 11th, 1918. The 11th hour of the 11th day of the 11th month. That's how they decided it would end. For days before, the rumors had been building. Whispers in the trenches, notes passed in canteens, hints in the way officers stood a little straighter, spoke a little softer. The enemy was crumbling. The end was coming. But no one quite believed it. After 4 years of mudblood and empty promises, how could anyone believe in peace? Still, the signs were there. On November 9th, the Kaiser abdicated, Germany's emperor gone overnight, slipping into exile. Crowds filled Berlin's streets shouting, not for glory, but for bread. Soldiers dropped rifles. Sailors refused orders. The German front began to dissolve like mist. And on November 11th, at 5:00 a.m., the Germans signed the armistice in a rail car in the Compiègne forest of France. 6 hours later, the guns would go silent. But until then, the war raged on. In those final hours, battles were still fought, orders still given, shells still fired. Some commanders pushed for one last assault, trying to take ground that would soon be meaningless. Thousands would die after the ink had dried in the space between war's end and war's pause. American Private Henry Gunther was one of them. He was from Baltimore, a quiet clerk drafted late in the war. On the morning of November 11th with peace, just minutes away, he charged a German machine gun nest. The Germans, knowing the war was seconds from ending, tried to wave him off, but he kept running, and at 10:59 a.m. he was shot, the last American to die in the Great War. Then, silence. After more than 4 years, the guns stopped. No fanfare, no parades, just quiet. And for the first time in years, soldiers heard birdsong instead of mortars, heard their own breath instead of someone else's scream. In Paris, church bells rang until their ropes frayed. In London, strangers danced in the streets. In New York, ticker tape rained down from windows, covering the canyons of Manhattan like snow. And on the front, in the ruined villages and cratered forests, men sat down and didn't move. Some wept, some stared, some laughed because they didn't know what else to do. They were alive, and they didn't yet understand what that meant. Because war doesn't end in a minute. It lingers, in lungs burned by gas, in eyes that won't close without seeing the wire, in the quiet spaces at dinner tables back home. But in that moment, 11 a.m., the world took its first breath in years. The Great War, they called it. The war to end all wars. They believed that then. They needed to. Because if it wasn't the last, if it was only the first, then what had it all been for? But no one wanted to ask that. Not yet. For now they just wanted to listen. To the silence. To the sound of survival. And let that be enough for one day. Homecoming. Coming home sounds simple, but after war, it never is. The first American troops returned in late 1918, with more following through 1919. They stepped off ships into crowded harbors. New York, Boston, Philadelphia. Bands played, flags waved, families reached. But something was different. The men who had left weren't quite the men who returned. They had seen too much. The eyes gave it away. Some came back proud, decorated, promoted, hardened into veterans. Others came back limping, coughing, or silent. Many carried wounds no one could see. Back then, it didn't have a name. Today, we'd call it trauma or PTSD. Then, they called it shell shock if they called it anything at all. And while they had been gone home, had changed too. The factories they left had grown larger. The women who'd taken their jobs weren't so quick to step aside. Immigrants from the South and Midwest had moved into northern cities, filling the gaps left behind. In some places, neighborhoods had shifted entirely. And underneath it all, something else was waiting. The influenza. While the world was still reeling from war, a virus swept across the globe. The 1918 flu pandemic killed more people than the war itself. Soldiers brought it home. Civilians carried it unknowingly. In the U.S. alone, over 600,000 would die. So the parades weren't always joyful. Sometimes they were funerals. Still, the government tried to make good on its promises. The soldiers were offered bonuses, small symbolic. The War Department issued uniforms for the trip home, train tickets, back pay. But there was no plan for the re-entry. No training for how to explain what you saw at Belleau Wood. No form to fill out for the nights you couldn't sleep. No medals for simply surviving. Some returned to welcome arms. Others came back to empty porches. For black soldiers, the return was especially complicated. They had served with honor over 350,000 African American men, enlisted or were drafted. Many fought in segregated units, and some served under French command because the U.S. wouldn't let them fight beside white Americans. They came home wearing the same uniform, expecting some degree of respect. Instead, they faced violence. In the summer of 1919, known as the Red Summer race riots, erupted across the country. Dozens of black veterans were attacked, beaten, even lynched sometimes, while still wearing their uniforms. The message was chilling. You may have fought over there, but don't expect equality here. Still, they had changed. The whole country had. Women had entered the workforce in record numbers. Many didn't want to leave. Suffrage gained momentum. By 1920, women had the right to vote, a shift that may not have happened so quickly without the war. And then there were the ideas. The war had been sold as a noble cause to defend democracy, to end all wars. But not everyone was convinced. Artists, writers, thinkers, many began to question it all. A generation called lost emerged in literature and film and music, not angry, just weary. And the economy. It surged briefly, then stumbled. Inflation rose. Labor strikes swept the country. Soldiers returning to their old jobs found them filled or gone. Resentment grew. Unrest simmered. So no coming home wasn't simple. It was a tangle of pride and confusion, of memory and forgetting. But one thing was certain. America wasn't the same place it had been in 1917. The war had bent it, reshaped it. And whether anyone realized it yet or not, the story wasn't over. Not by a long shot. The treaty that didn't end it. Peace was never going to be easy, not after that much blood. The leaders of the victorious nations gathered in Paris in 1919 beneath chandeliers and flags, and the watchful eyes of statues older than the countries they represented. They came with pens instead of rifles, but the mood was far from peaceful. Woodrow Wilson. America's president arrived like a prophet. He was greeted in Europe like a hero, cheering crowds, flowers, children, waving American flags. He had brought with him a dream, not just peace, but a new world order. His idea, the 14 points. A bold vision of open diplomacy, free trade, disarmament, and most famously, a League of Nations that would settle disputes before they became wars. Wilson believed the Great War had happened because old empires played old games. He wanted to end the games altogether. But the other leaders, the British, the French, the Italians, they weren't interested in dreams. They wanted guarantees. They wanted Germany punished. France had been ravaged, towns reduced to ash, a generation lost. They wanted security. They wanted revenge. Britain wanted control of the seas. Italy wanted land. And all of them wanted someone to pay for what had happened. That someone was Germany. And so, despite Wilson's protests, the Treaty of Versailles took shape like a blade. Germany would lose territory, its colonies stripped, its army limited, its navy gutted. But the sharpest cut was Article 231, the War Guilt Clause. Germany had to accept full responsibility for starting the war. And with that clause came reparations, vast sums of money Germany didn't have, but would be forced to pay. It wasn't just punishment. It was humiliation, stamped into a treaty, and signed in the same room where Germany had once declared its empire. Wilson didn't like it, but he accepted it because the League of Nations was included, and he believed the League would fix what the treaty broke. Back home, though, the reception was cold. Senators didn't like the idea of America being tied to foreign decisions. Isolationists said the League would drag the U.S. into more wars. Some thought Wilson had given too much. Others just didn't trust anything signed in French palaces. Wilson went on tour speaking in towns and cities, trying to win public support. He rode trains, gave speeches, stood in the rain. He poured everything he had into defending the League, and it broke him. In October 1919, Wilson collapsed, suffered a stroke that left him partially paralyzed, hidden from view for months. His wife helped run the White House while he recovered in secret. But the treaty, it stalled. And in March 1920, the U.S. Senate voted. They rejected the Treaty of Versailles. America had fought the war, helped win, it helped write the peace, and then walked away from it. The League of Nations went ahead without us. Wilson, once hailed as the voice of peace, left office a broken man, sick, disappointed, and silenced. And Germany wounded, humiliated, impoverished. The seeds were planted. Bitter seeds. The kind that don't grow right. Everyone thought the war was over. But sometimes, peace is just the pause between chapters. The Forgotten War. They called it the Great War, but within a generation, it would have a new name, World War I. Because peace didn't last. Not really. For a few brief years in the early 1920s, there was a kind of stunned calm, a sense that the world had burned itself out, and now needed to catch its breath. In America, we called it a return to normalcy. That was President Harding's word. People wanted stability, quiet, familiar rhythms. And for a time, they got it. Jazz clubs filled the nights, factories hummed, radios crackled, Ford rolled out more cars, women voted, skyscrapers grew. It felt like a new age, an American age. But the war never quite left. Not really. You could see it in the amputees lining the street corners selling pencils, in the shell-shocked men pacing hospital hallways, staring past everything, in the faces of mothers who smiled a little too softly when they said, "My son was in France." And if you couldn't see it, you could feel it like a draft through a closed window. America tried to forget. We never built a grand battlefield in our heartland, never turned fields into cemeteries like France. Our dead were buried over there, white crosses in rows across oceans. Most Americans never saw them. They read names in newspapers and moved on. But some didn't forget. Veterans marched in parades until the crowds got smaller. They formed the American Legion, pushed for benefits, for respect. And in 1932, in the midst of the Great Depression, tens of thousands of them, many unemployed and desperate, marched on Washington to demand early payment of promised bonuses. It was called the Bonus Army. They camped in tents on the edges of the Capitol, peaceful and proud. But the government saw them as a threat. President Hoover sent in troops, tanks, cavalry, tear gas to clear the camps. The same soldiers who had once fought for liberty were now being driven from their own capital. And that wasn't the only echo of the war. In Europe, Germany was reeling. The Treaty of Versailles had crushed its economy. Inflation skyrocketed. The middle class vanished. Despair set in. And from that despair rose a man with a mustache, a uniform, and a message of vengeance. Adolf Hitler. He had been a soldier in World War I, a messenger in the trenches. He wore its scars. And he would use those scars to convince a broken people that the war hadn't been lost, only betrayed. That Germany didn't need peace, it needed strength. Meanwhile, in America, the 1930s brought fear of another kind, economic collapse. Wall Street fell, banks closed, breadlines formed, and the idea of another foreign war unthinkable. Congress passed laws to keep America out of European conflicts, neutrality acts designed to prevent us from getting dragged in again. No more secret treaties, no more arms sales, no more Wilsonian dreams. But the world didn't stay neutral. Fascism rose, borders fell, armies marched, and by the end of that decade, the unthinkable became real again. But in those quiet years between the wars, the First World War began to fade into the background. No movies, no headlines, just memories sitting quietly in old photo albums and attic trunks. The war that was supposed to end all wars became the war we tried not to talk about, until one day it had to be talked about again. A generation's echo. By the mid-1930s, you could walk into a diner in Kansas or a barber shop in Maine and ask an old man about the war, and he might say, "Which one?" That's how fast memory fades. and how quickly history returns. The generation that fought in World War I didn't call themselves heroes. They didn't have that word waiting for them at the docks. No medals in airports, no Hollywood epics. They came home, quietly returned to work, buried their nightmares, and raised families under roofs built by GI loans and sweat. They were farmers again, mailmen, bookkeepers. Some never spoke of the trenches, others could only speak of them. And slowly their war slipped into the past tense. By the late 1930s, the world was changing again, but this time faster. In Germany, Hitler had seized power, built autobahns, burned books, rearmed the military in defiance of the Treaty of Versailles. In Italy, Mussolini struck poses like Caesar and sent troops to Ethiopia. In Japan, a military empire took hold, marching into China with fire and steel. The world tilted toward darkness again, but America hesitated. We were busy trying to fix the economy. Roosevelt was in office, the New Deal was underway, and most Americans, burned by the last war, haunted by its cost, wanted nothing to do with another one. The American First Movement gained strength. Famous voices like Charles Lindbergh warned against foreign entanglements. Congress passed more neutrality acts. No arms to belligerents, no loans to fighting nations. It was a shield made of laws and distance. But distance wasn't enough last time, and it wouldn't be this time either. Still, something interesting happened beneath the surface. The veterans of World War I, those same doughboys who once scrambled through the Argonne, watched as the world started to crack again. And many of them saw it coming. They saw the same arrogance, the same flags, the same drumbeat, and they spoke up. Some re-enlisted when war came again. Others became instructors, training a new wave of soldiers for what was to come. Still others simply warned their sons, "This will not be over quickly. Be ready." Because they had seen how it starts. They remembered what leaders promise, how crowds cheer, how uniforms multiply. And they remembered how hard it is to make it stop. In literature, the war remained a ghost. Hemingway's A Farewell to Arms, remarks all quiet on the Western Front. Poets like Wilfred Owen and Siegfried Sassoon, their words captured something raw and aching that official histories never could. The war had passed, but it had also marked everything that came after. The shape of maps, the shape of families, the shape of grief. And as the 1940s approached, the generation that had fought over there realized something terrifying. Their war might not be history after all. It might just be prologue. And the next chapter was already stirring. The war that changed us. Long before World War II reshaped the world, World War I reshaped America. It didn't always look like it. There were no ruined cities here, no burned-out fields. But the change was deep, quiet, structural, permanent. Before the war, the U.S. had been a reluctant participant in world affairs. After it, we were something else, a power. Not an empire like Britain, not a defeated monarchy like Germany, but a new kind of force, industrial, democratic, ambitious. The numbers tell part of the story. The U.S. entered the war late and still suffered over 116,000 deaths. But it also mobilized over 4 million men, built thousands of planes and ships, and exported not just goods, but influence. We loaned billions to allies. We helped redraw borders. We arrived just in time to win, and then decided not to stay at the table. And yet the world remembered us. Even without joining the League of Nations, America's culture industry and voice began to echo across oceans. Jazz, Hollywood, the automobile, Coca-Cola. The idea of America as something modern, loud and free was becoming global. And back home, something else had shifted. The role of government had grown. To manage the war, Washington had taken control of industries, food supplies, railroads. It had shaped public opinion, censored the press, launched massive propaganda campaigns. The machinery didn't go away when the guns stopped. It just shifted. You can see its legacy in everything from New Deal programs to military infrastructure, to the very idea that Washington could and should solve national problems. And then there was the social fabric. Women, after stepping into jobs and leadership roles during the war, weren't content to go back to silence. The push for suffrage turned into success. By 1920, the 19th Amendment passed. Women could vote. A war helped open the door. African American soldiers came home too. Many had served with honor. Some in France had been treated with more respect than they'd known in their own country. But back home, they were still denied equal rights. Still, they had tasted something, a broad dignity, and that memory would fuel movements for decades to come. In cities like Chicago and Harlem, a new cultural energy began to rise, the Harlem Renaissance, born in part from the migration of black families during the war and the voices of black veterans after it. The war had scattered people, then rearranged them. Immigrants, too, had fought and died in American uniforms. Italians, Irish, Poles, Jews, Germans. Their children would grow up with a foot in two worlds, the one they came from and the one they'd bled for. Even our language changed. We started calling it the service. Started talking about overseas, not as a mystery, but as a memory. And we learned for the first time what it meant to send thousands of boys to fight, and then live with their absence. We built monuments. We named highways and schools. We held parades that slowly, year by year, grew smaller. But the war remained. In photos on mantelpieces, in medals tucked into drawers, in the silence between generations. It didn't just change the map, it changed us. And though the Roaring Twenties would try to drown that memory in jazz and motion, it never truly faded. Because once a country sends its sons to fight in the mud, it never walks the same again. A world rearranged by the end of World War I. The map of the world didn't just look different, it was different. Old empires had crumbled. New nations were drawn with ink and ambition, and for better or worse, the future was being redrawn in real time. The Austro-Hungarian Empire gone, the Ottoman Empire dissolved, Russia. In revolution, the Tsar executed the Bolsheviks' rising civil war raging, and in their place, a scatter of new names: Poland, Czechoslovakia, Yugoslavia, Finland, Estonia, Latvia, Lithuania, nations with proud people, deep histories, but suddenly thrown into the light with fragile borders and high hopes. Some called it self-determination, the dream that people could govern themselves, choose their leaders, speak their languages without fear. But in truth, much of it was designed by outsiders in high-ceilinged rooms, trading colonies like cards. Lines were drawn that ignored tribes. Promised lands were promised twice. New wounds were opened before old ones had even scarred. The Middle East, Britain and France, carved it into mandates, not quite colonies, but close. The Arabs, who had been encouraged to revolt against the Ottomans with hopes of independence, watched their promised freedom vanish into European paperwork. Palestine, Iraq, Syria, Lebanon, all reshaped by foreign pens. In Asia, Japan, which had joined the Allies, was gaining power, demanding territory recognition, a place among the great empires. And it would not forget the way the West dismissed its ambitions even after its sacrifices. That dismissal would echo into the next war. Meanwhile, Germany, stripped by the Treaty of Versailles, simmered with anger. Its colonies gone, its economy strangled, its people humiliated. The reparations demanded by the treaty weren't just heavy, they were crushing. Inflation soared. In the early 1920s, German money became so worthless that people carried it in wheelbarrows to buy bread. Children played with bundles of marks like toys. Grandmothers burned paper bills to keep warm. And in that despair came bitterness. And in that bitterness came radicals. The soil had been laid. And though peace had technically arrived, the future was restless. In Russia, the Bolsheviks took power and declared a new kind of war, a class war. Communism spread like a spark in dry brush, terrifying the West. The Cold War hadn't started yet, but the chill was already in the air. Back in America, we pulled inward. We tightened immigration laws, raised tariffs, watched Europe through the newspapers, and decided not again. The Senate passed laws that made it harder to get involved overseas. And the public. They were busy chasing prosperity cars, radios, movies, jazz. But the war had rearranged more than borders. It had rearranged ambition. The United States had gone to Europe to make the world safe for democracy. But now we just wanted to stay out of the world's mess. Except, the world had a way of finding us. The peace was uneasy, the map redrawn but unstable, and the lessons of 1918 were already being forgotten in the rush toward 1929. History rarely repeats, but it echoes. And somewhere in those echoes, a storm was building again. When the guns went quiet. My grandfather never talked much about the war. He kept a folded photo in his wallet, a black and white of 3 young men, sitting on a wooden crate in France, smiling like they didn't know what was coming next. Only one of them made it home. Sometimes late at night, he'd take the photo out and just look at it. Didn't say much, didn't have to. The silence said enough. World War I was supposed to be the war that ended all wars. It wasn't. But it did change the world. Not in one loud, clean break, but in a slow shift like a giant continent grinding beneath our feet. It introduced the modern age, the tank, the machine gun, the airplane, mass propaganda, mass production, mass grief. It gave us new borders, new fears, and a new kind of soldier, one who returned home, not to cheers, but to questions. One who often said, "I don't know what it was for, but I couldn't not go." The war shaped the 20th century in ways we still live with. It cracked open empires. It planted the seeds of fascism, communism, and global American power. It showed the world that technology could save you or destroy you faster than ever imagined. But beyond the politics and the treaties and the shifting lines on maps, there's one simple truth. Millions of people died, for reasons they barely understood, and many of the ones who lived carried that confusion with them for the rest of their lives. And yet here we are, still trying to understand it, still trying to remember it clearly enough that maybe, just maybe, we don't repeat it. Maybe that's why I'm telling you this now, not to shock you, not to make you sad, but because history belongs to the living. It's not locked in textbooks or marble monuments. It's in our voices, in our questions, in the stories we pass along when the room is quiet and someone says, "What was it like back then?" So, tonight, as you drift off, know this. There were once boys who thought they'd be home by Christmas. They left behind farms, cities, classrooms, and families. Some came back with medals. Some didn't come back at all. But every one of them believed in some way they were building a better world. And maybe, just maybe, by remembering them, by really remembering them, we still can. Thanks for listening to History Before Bed. Sleep well. And until next time, good night.